Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
All right, second time's the charm. Okay. So welcome to the Q&A portion of the Radical Urbanism session here at The World Transformed. I'm Justin Roczniak, also known on the internet as Do Not Eat. And I built the town of Carlingdon-by-Sea, and everything you just saw, all the stuff you just saw over the past hour and 20 minutes. Obviously, I was not one of the people talking. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a Q&A panel for the folks who spoke over the past hour, 20 minutes. So you can ask them some questions. And let them introduce themselves, I guess.
Hi, yeah, my name's Chris Saltmarsh, and I'm one of the co-founders of Labour for a Green New Deal. So yeah, I've been involved in campaigning for a socialist Green New Deal here in the UK, using the Labour Party as a vehicle and really kind of promoting public ownership as a socialist response for climate and economic injustice crises.
I'm Pearl. I'm a transport planner and I'm a member of London Cycling Campaign.
Hi everyone, I'm Fernanda Balata and I work at the New Economics Foundation, which is a think tank based in London, working with communities and policymakers across the UK.
Hi, I'm Selina Jorihat and I'm one of the organisers of the National Food Service Campaign.
All right, so that's who we got at the moment, at least. So I guess this is the time for all y'all to ask questions in the chat. Also, we have a few questions which we sort of preordained would happen, which I forget what the first one is. Hold on. I got to go through the scroll back here. Oh, there it is. It's on the screen. We've heard a utopian picture of the changes a Green New Deal could bring to the built environment of a town. What should be the priority? What should the priorities be? What should be first on the list for the next few years? And
I can jump in first, if that's all right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think this is a good question because a lot of what we heard over the past kind of hour and 20 minutes was a lot of like really lofty ambitions and real quite like transformative change for a town like Carlingdon. But obviously, one of the big ideas of the Green New Deal is that would happen over the best part of a decade. So I do think it's important to have a think about what's the first year or two of the Green New Deal. And I think for me, one of the big things is transport, and I'll let maybe Pearl talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I think using transport as a lens is good because it's we can think about what are the kind of immediate very like kind of obvious changes that we can make and kind of use to almost kind of create a consent for the type of transformations that we want. And so you talk to anyone really around the country and ask them kind of what issues they have with where they live, and very often it's public transport systems or roads or traffic, but other things like you go to most towns and you look at kind of like the high street, and it's often like abandoned and lots of empty shops and stuff. And so kind of those very visual things that you could, with kind of a relatively modest amount of investment, really begin to revitalize. Revitalizing high streets could really feed into the kind of green jobs program. If you're going to start investing in green jobs for all, and in the video we said that green jobs don't just have to be in kind of industry or manufacturing or renewable energy. They can be kind of basically any job that is zero carbon. Just beginning using the first few years of investment to kind of bring a baseline level of prosperity and like dignity and like pride in the places that we live, and then using those kind of relatively modest gains to build consent for the more like ambitious transformations, I think is probably quite a good place to start.
Shall I go?
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree that transport is a really visual change that is a really it will be quite a effective initial change. I think especially the low traffic neighborhoods, they can be implemented now. Lots of towns have already implemented them during the coronavirus. So there are some in Hackney, there are some in Brighton already. And they're really great because you walk out of your door and you can just immediately see that the street is different. And they're, that's how the Netherlands is laid out. Just everywhere in every town in the Netherlands is a lot more low traffic, kind of as a base level. So we can do those immediately. Also, I think we can widen the pavements in Carlingdon now. The council can just do that. There's nothing to stop them just doing that now, and that's a really nice, that's a really effective measure for particularly the elderly people getting around, and with the coronavirus as well. It's something that's been implemented to assist social distancing. There's also cycle lanes that I don't expect Carlingdon would have many of. There's not a lot of towns in the UK that have a good network of cycle lanes, but that's an immediate change that will obviously assist lots of people in getting around. Loads of people are really afraid of public transport now because of the coronavirus, quite rightly. But if you provide them with the infrastructure to make that change and make that shift, then I think that they will do that quite quickly, and that will kind of kickstart the town.
So in the context of a national food service for a Green New Deal, I think that implementing lots of social eating spaces in Carlingdon as well as across the country would be a really good place to start, because not only would this encourage a level of community resilience to try and allow communities to come together during this difficult time, it would also start to reduce the amount of surplus food as a kind of stopgap to reduce the amount that's going on at the moment. But also I think that we should be trying to encourage more sustainable and ethical trade links with farmers as a starting point, because this would try and tackle issues within the food system at all levels. This is important both in the context of sustainability, but also in the context of Brexit.
So I'll jump in, and I think those are very important priorities already mentioned. So I'll go for a different one. I think my two main priorities would be definitely, especially in the context now, on how we support and create green and jobs in the town. But I will mention the issues of our coastal adaptation, which I wasn't able to do in my presentation because I had so many examples to talk about in terms of a Blue New Deal and how you focus on coastal and marine resources for development of the town. But as we know, coastal adaptation and the management of our coast and how we're going to cope with the impacts of climate change, it takes a long time to do those things. So, for example, restoring coastal habitats and providing more long-term and cost-effective flood alleviation. Some areas might be dealing with coastal erosion. So I'm taking Carlington is dealing with the need for restoration of habitats, because for a long time there's been coastal squeeze of our coast in terms of just lots of development on the coast and decreasing the ability of actually coastal habitats to perform their duty in terms of protecting us against sea level rise. So I would say that would be a good priority at the beginning, because it takes time basically to do those things, and climate change is only going to get worse quite quickly. So.
Am I back? Okay. Well, I guess the next question then is, what do you think the biggest challenges will be to realizing the lofty ambitions we've already heard about, and how might we overcome them?
Yeah, if I go first again on that, I mean, I think for me, one of the real big challenges is the past, the past decade of British politics and probably even longer as well has been defined really by austerity, and like that's obviously had like a material impact on these towns. It's had a material impact on people's lives and their livelihoods in an overwhelmingly negative way. But I think it's also had a kind of cultural and ideological impact that is really counter to the ambitions of the Green New Deal. Like what we're talking about will require really huge amounts of investment. It will require a kind of re-understanding of public spending, not as a kind of bad thing to be avoided or scrimped on, but as a positive thing that, as I say, can be an investment in kind of collective futures and in prosperity, but also as relatively affordable and compared to the costs of climate breakdown. So I think in part there's a kind of ideological pushback to be waged there to and I think the last 5 years of kind of the Labour Party led by Corbyn did a good job of doing that, but I don't think we fully kind of won the argument. And I think as well, I think it relates to the previous question of beginning, I think you can make a kind of abstract argument as effectively as you want. It will only be through people kind of seeing the material improvements to our lives, to our built environment, in when we can really kind of begin to generate buy-in to the kind of like the scales of investment that we're looking for.
Sorry to jump the order, but to just build on what Chris has been saying, I think it's not only thinking about an ideological change, but also about how we see our place within making Green New Deal, because it can't just come from the top up. It's also got to come from within communities, and we need a community response where everybody's working towards this.
If I may jump in, so I think it's similar to some of the things that Chris has said, but for me, the main issue is the issue of trust, trust in the transition, because of the historical context in the UK about how we've managed industrial transitions in the past. You have the mining, coal miners, examples in the north back in the 80s. I think the issue of trust is challenging in the UK because you've got a lot of powers that have been taken away from workers, for example, in unions. So that kind of need for communities to come together and do something, it's challenging within that context. So how do you build trust? And NEF is doing some work in this space. We have a Just Transition program, and we're working the Yorkshire and Humber, for example, but also, again, we've been working with coastal communities. And I think the first thing is for local authorities and other organizations that are mobilizing or can mobilize to make some of those changes, to really tackle power head on, and recognize that community and local small businesses don't feel like they actually have a say in that transformation, and so they're going to have to implement different processes for this. So, for example, some places are setting up commissions for just transition, bringing the voices of unions and workers as part of that process in terms of investing locally and what is going to be invested in. There are lots of citizens' assemblies taking place across the country as well. So there's loads of new ways to, I guess, engage people, but they must be connected to that kind of power for decision-making change. So, and obviously the other big challenge is the economic model, especially for local areas. There is an expectation local areas need to increase GVA, the gross value added, which then increases GDP. That's still very much how our economy is run. And so, they're going to have to think and commit about how they can actually aim for greater well-being and economic resilience and environmental sustainability as part of of those investments and those developments locally, and help actually communities to fight for the bigger change that would enable us to have a more resilient economy.
Shall I do the transport challenges? I think there are a lot of challenges in the transport sector. Firstly, a kind of car culture in the UK, that we only see cycling as for children or for middle-aged men in lycra, and that's completely different to how the rest of even Northern Europe sees cycling. So that's only a cultural barrier that's got to overcome. Also, legally, I suggested a council-owned bus company, which is actually illegal in the UK at the moment. Since 2017, councils aren't allowed to set up and run new council-owned bus companies, which is obviously quite a central part of my vision for Carlingdon. So we'd have to kind of challenge that at a national level, and I think that's a really good opportunity for linking up with other towns to challenge that law. But the main challenge, I think, would be the train network. I love trains as much as the next guy, but I didn't talk about them in my talk because I stopped at the boundary of Carlingdon. And realistically, one town doesn't have control over the national train network, but that is definitely the weakest link in the transport system. Right now, the privatised train network is there to make money for train companies, not to get people around. And that's why it's so slow and complicated. Ticketing is so expensive. I remember we subsidised train franchises. So even though they're privatised, we as individuals are paying twice, once as taxpayers and once as ticket purchasers. The evidence shows even that privatised train companies have a poorer customer satisfaction and are more inefficient. So they need to be analysed, and only then can we start thinking about free ticketing, upgrading the network, and using trains to replace domestic flights.
I have a question sort of in that vein, or which is tangentially related before we properly throw this to the audience. You know, especially with regard to like the hot button issue of electrifying public transit. You know, the big thing is lithium. You know, we're stealing it from the global south or whatever, you know. So how do we mitigate the effects of a Green New Deal on the global south and ensure they benefit from it, rather than it just being, you know, this is something that happens in like Northern Europe, or something that happens in America, something that happens in, you know, how do we make sure we're not doing too much exploitation, or ideally any exploitation at all? I guess exploitation in like the sense that you know, we're screwing people over.
Yeah, if I jump in quickly, I'm sure others have something to say on this as well. I think yeah, that issue that Justin highlights is probably one of the biggest like contradictions of kind of ideas around a Green New Deal to resolve, and I think it's one that there have been some really good ideas on resolving, but I think as a movement, it's one that we've kind of not quite cracked yet. My ideas on it would be that I think promoting public ownership domestically is probably one of the best ways of ensuring kind of supply chain justice globally. So if, you know, if it's car or public transport manufacturing, battery manufacturing, renewable energy manufacturing, if those things are left to the kind of the private sector, then those private companies will kind of minimize costs to maximize their profits. If we bring them into the public sector, if we have really strict procurement rules, if we kind of begin to conceive of public procurement as a tool for social justice and global justice, then we can begin to put conditions on the kind of the materials that we're sourcing, and so we can promote you know, a global living wage, we can promote workers' rights, we can promote sustainable resource extraction globally, and we can also, you know, as a country, as a, you know, a relatively powerful country, obviously that comes from kind of a history of colonialism, we can begin to promote democratic public ownership and principles of kind of land sovereignty internationally, where, you know, our current kind of institutional architecture in the global kind of political sphere is oriented towards promoting free markets and promoting privatization. We can, you know, with a Green New Deal domestically, we could then, yeah, translate that into our role in the international sphere to promote, yeah, democratic public ownership and sovereignty, to make sure that communities that are most affected by lithium extraction, as an example, or other kind of rare earth minerals that will actually be needed to be extracted more potentially for a renewable transition, to make sure that's done with justice and not unsustainable, both environmentally but also in a human sense. Anyone else want to come in?
I could go for a minute.
Oh, that works.
I think that's a really good point about the limited resources that we will have for the future. It's not just the carbon dioxide emissions from electric cars and electric buses that are the problem. There are also resource issues and extraction issues, ethical problems there, and that's why the kind of vision that I had was, it was really not it was not an electrified version of what we have now. I don't necessarily see that electric cars on the scale that we have now and on the types of energy that are being produced to make that electricity. I don't think that's sustainable, and that's not really like part of a long-term Green New Deal vision. And there's also all the problems that we still have with a high level of car ownership, even if all the cars were electric. You know, road violence, community severance, a lack of kind of sense of community on the streets. So it kind of throwing all our eggs into the electric vehicles basket isn't just bad in terms of battery and lithium resource use. It would lock us into a really unsustainable future. So yeah, not for me.
Yeah, I'll just jump in just quickly, just to agree with Pearl that I think just touching on the issue of really, like, you know, maintaining levels of consumption as it is now, just with different technologies, which is not, you know, especially coming from the UK, like that's not how we can transition, you know, to a sustainable and fair economy. And I don't know necessarily about the technologies that are out there. I'm sure there will be, but you know, apart from kind of, you know, making dirty energy clean energy, it is about like how much energy we use, and so just to say that, like, I'm originally from Brazil, and I think the issue of trade, again, I'm not familiar with trade in terms of but you know, the lithium and the resources needed for electric cars and other vehicles, but certainly in terms of like deforestation, for example, in the Amazon, like, you know, that is a big role that we play in making trade deals, and how we drive unsustainable consumption of natural resources elsewhere in the world. So trade is a really key part of it, and obviously the UK coming out of the EU. With Brexit, we were negotiating trade deals. I don't have a lot of hope with this government, unfortunately, and that will make a priority. But environment sustainability and workers' rights need to be front and center in new trade deals. That's for sure.
I have to unmute myself. Right. I forgot about that. Right. Are we good for the next question? Now that we're finally throwing it to the audience. Okay. So technology continues to evolve every year. Are there any upcoming technological advancements that you want to add to a plan for a Green New Deal? I actually have a bit of an answer to this one, which sort of informed how I sort of built the city of Carlington after the Green New Deal. One of the things you might notice while you're watching the video is that there are electric buses, but they're not battery buses. They're trolley buses. You know, they're powered from overhead wires. This is an old, reliable technology, does not require getting a huge amount of lithium from, the global south or wherever. It's just, copper wires. We've had it for 100 years. We got a lot of the technology that we need for, green energy, for a greener lifestyle already exists. So, and of course, copper is very recyclable. You can just, if you ever drop something off that's copper on the sidewalk, someone will come around and recycle it for you eventually. But yeah, so, I would say, I would say, from the perspective who built the city, I tried to go for older tech than newer tech, but let's hear what the panelists think.
I can jump in if no one else is ready to go. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm a technologist necessarily, so not necessarily the best person to answer this question. But one thing I have been thinking about a little bit is, and the idea of, I guess, like fully automated luxury communism is like, quite, sometimes it's derided, sometimes it's seen as kind of overly utopian. But I think, in Aaron Bastani's book, one of the things he writes about is asteroid mining, and obviously on the one hand, I think it's like a reasonably provocative thing to be putting out there, but I think on the other hand, it almost like relates back to the previous question on lithium. And if the proposition, right, is that if we could like master asteroid mining, then we would have a kind of abundance of those kind of rare minerals that are needed, and it would almost kind of unlock the potential for a kind of material abundance that our current finite planet doesn't allow for. Obviously, there's all kinds of contradictions, like it would, the fuel that you need to like get to space on the reg. How does that relate to decarbonization? Who owns asteroid mining? Could you be doing that in a publicly owned way? Could you stop Elon Musk from doing it? I mean, I think those questions of things like asteroid mining can seem to be potentially like overly utopian for the like maybe decade or 2 or 3 that we have to decarbonize. But I do think it presents like interesting both possibilities and challenges that on the left we shouldn't like cower away from, even if it shouldn't necessarily be the priority of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, on his book, actually, it's a really interesting book, but I completely disagree with his vision of transport in the future. It focuses quite a lot on self-driving cars, which I think are a negative technological development. Remember, they are driven by the private technological sector, and so a reduction in driving doesn't necessarily mean we'll see a reduction in time spent in the car. You might automate some jobs, for instance, Uber drivers, they'll then be out of a job. I don't necessarily see that as fair, especially when they wouldn't necessarily have another job immediately ready. And in addition, if you're spending less time driving, which is obviously an activity you need to give your whole attention to, I think in the vision that he describes, some people would end up spending more time working, and we've already seen this during the coronavirus. People working from home are saving that traveling time, but now we're getting invited to loads of breakfast time meetings and conferences, and just a kind of shift away from using travel time, but we're just using it for working instead. And in a society where we all want to work less, I don't really see that as a positive. In addition, a whole city of self-driving cars, the only way they would get around is, realistically, if you stopped pedestrians wandering out into the road, because you can't use eye contact in the same way if it's a self-driving car. So they would need to like physically prevent pedestrians walking out into the road all the time. So I feel like in the future, if we had a lot of self-driving cars, then you would see the criminalization of pedestrians and perhaps physical barriers, fences between the pavement and the road. a kind of extension of the criminalization of jaywalking, which they have in America. So just walking out when it's a red man on a pedestrian crossing. So that would also be obviously a negative effect. Luckily, there's a good way off, so we don't need to worry about that for a little while.
This is probably quite a boring answer to the question, but I feel like the technological developments within waste management, so to do with recycling and reusing food waste, are probably the thing that would close the gap within the food system currently to make it even more sustainable and suitable for a Green New Deal. So that's what I would do, so that we would have zero waste and it would be a closed loop food system.
Fernanda, do you have anything, or can we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I was going to say, do I need to answer as well? No, not really, but I really like Selena's point.
Okay. All right. So our next question then is, how would you stop reprivatization via democratic means after you increased public ownership? Right. You know, of course, something very familiar in Britain. You know, RIP British Rail.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in quickly on that one first. I mean, I guess, yeah, all I'd say is that both, you know, nationalization or democratic public ownership and privatization, you know, these are things that are or have historically been, you know, directed by the state. You know, it's not like there's a kind of organic privatization of things. You know, when council housing was sold off and, you know, essentially privatized, that was something that was directed like by the Thatcher government, and like all of the privatizations of public utilities that we saw like throughout the 80s and 90s, like they were directed by the state. And like similarly, when, you know, when utilities were brought into public ownership, you know, that was also done, you know, done through the state. And I guess what, you know, I think there's often a debate in kind of like climate and Green New Deal circles about whether you go for a kind of cooperative public ownership model or a kind of centralized state public ownership model. And I think different utilities will obviously require different you know, different responses in that regard. You know, the National Health Service, for example, the National Grid, these are things that benefit from a kind of national central planning, whereas, you know, maybe you could imagine types of renewable energy that do really well in a kind of cooperative model. So I guess, yeah, just kind of baking into the structure of the companies that the democracy of the public ownership comes through, you know, maybe national and municipal politics. They come from consent, popular consent, through elections and through kind of economic democracy. You know, maybe a more cooperative model of public ownership like does make it more susceptible to privatization.
I also think it's important that we allow communities to be invested within different parts of a Green New Deal and of this infrastructure, because then it means that people want to actively play a part in it, and it's more sustainable than if it's just through a top-down system.
Hold on. I'm looking for a good question for us to conclude the session. I think I saw one. Maybe. Sorry, I've never done a panel before. You have to bear with me for a second. Oh, I guess, okay, this is a good one here. How do we get Starmer's labor to actually support these policies? Oh boy. All right.
Cool. I can jump in on that first, but I'm sure everyone has hashtag opinions. I mean, yeah, I guess my concluding answer to this will be a plug for Labour for a Green New Deal, perhaps naturally. I mean, yeah, I guess from our perspective as Labour for a Green New Deal, we want to draw kind of inspiration from what we kind of collectively managed to achieve last year. You know, the Labour Party's internal democracy is very far from perfect, but we were able to kind of to use it, to work through it, to create not just to kind of mechanically kind of pass a motion in favor of particular policies, but to create kind of popular support for them and almost create like a sense of inevitability. And so I think we want to continue to like build power within the Labour Party, really make the kind of socialist Green New Deal policies that we've outlined today and previously really common sense, to the extent that it would be kind of electorally, both within and outside the Labour Party, kind of nonsensical to abandon them. But as well, I think it's really important to like build power outside of the Labour Party, both acting against, within and against the Labour Party. And so, one of the big I think one of the big propositions that we make is that the climate crisis is a class crisis. It's a symptom of class war waged like against the poor by the rich. And so we need to rebuild class power. We do that through trade unions and workplaces. And really I think we need to have a vibrant, militant trade union movement that is prepared to push Starmer's Labour Party to have radical climate justice, Green New Deal policies, because ultimately it's going to be the working class in this country and around the world that suffer from the climate crisis more than anyone else, and certainly first and worst.
I totally agree with Chris's point that we need to create an inevitability to the infrastructure that we're building. And I think a lot of the things that we've all been talking about already exist, be it within this country or across Europe and across the world. And I think that it's important that we start building all of this together so that Starmer and the state kind of have no choice but to encourage and fund these things, because we know that it's all necessary. We know that we need a Green New Deal, and we need to show and prove this to Starmer and the rest of the Labour Party.
I mean, if they just kept on some of the same policies that Corbyn introduced, then they'd already be ahead of the game. They had some great transport policies under his transport minister. Shadow minister. In addition, the Tories are kind of leading the way on this at the moment. Obviously, they stole some of Corbyn's policy proposals, but they're also funding funding low traffic neighbourhoods and cycle lanes, which is might be surprising, but it seems like they've clocked the mood of the country, and they're supporting councils when councils want to do that. So if they, want to steal some of those Tory votes, I think that would definitely be worth it for Keir Starmer. In addition, person against infrastructure to make cycling and walking easier, there is 6.5 in favour. So that means that the majority of people in the country are actually in favour of measures to support active travel. So if they want to win votes, then they can support active travel measures.
Just to add, and I don't have much more to add. I do agree that a key part of getting those policies supported by the Labour Party is about building more collective power, especially with workers' unions, but also acknowledging that that's very difficult at the moment as well, the COVID crisis and the rise in unemployment. I think for people like the organization I'm representing and different grassroots groups across the country, we really need to do the work in places and how we can actually bring workers and communities that have suffered for so long, with very poor, badly run industrial transitions, and now are facing even more challenges. Like, how are we going to build that kind of power? And so the work needs to be done in places, and it needs to acknowledge that people will be at different, in different positions, that they might not be as willing to kind of just come together and fight for things. But how can we bring people in places to do that? I think that's the important work now, and anyone who has any sort of kind of power and resources to actually add and help build that power from the ground in terms of the different processes that are taking place. Yeah, I think that would be the main thing. But there's also like lots of external things that are happening that will probably, I think Chris or Selena talk about, like make it almost like impossible to ignore, that we need to change how things are and have been done in the past. Thanks everyone for coming to see the City Skylines Radical Urbanism session here at The World Transformed. Thanks to all our panelists for contributing. And what else do I say? I guess that's the end. All right.
Imagine, demand, and build a world transformed.